Good morning and welcome to Law News Network. I'm Jesse Weber. Thanks for joining us. We have a big day today, a very big day, a lot to discuss. First up, day one in the Jessica Chambers trial. The Jessica Chambers case, there you go. This horrifying case out of Mississippi. This is the case, this is the trial of Quentin Tellis. He's been charged with capital murder in the death of 19-year-old Jessica Chambers. He's been charged with burning this young girl alive, leaving her to die on a North Mississippi road, only for her to succumb to her injuries the next day. Quentin Tellis, he's 29 years old. He's been charged with the murder of Jessica Chambers, and this occurred on December 6, 2014. He faces life in prison without the possibility of parole, and he has pled not guilty. Today, at around 2 p.m., we expect this trial to start with opening arguments and testimony. We believe that about 40 witnesses will be called to the stand in this trial. We expect it to last up to 2 weeks, maybe even longer. Just to give you a bit of background about this horrifying case, and we're going to be analyzing it a little bit in anticipation of the trial to begin later. Firefighters in Cortland, Mississippi found Chambers beside her burning car on a remote road near a tree farm. Chambers was quickly taken to a Memphis hospital at 60 miles to the north with burns over 90% of her body. She died hours later. This is a horrifying case. We don't have a ton of information yet. That's why we're going to be paying very close attention to this case to understand what does the prosecution have against Mr. Tellis, and can they finally bring justice for Jessica? Well, we hope so, because this investigation went on for over a year and they had no suspects. We'll get a little bit into that about who they looked at initially, and now they have Quentin Tellis in custody. He has been charged, and now the trial will begin. But we also have some other content for you today to talk about. A little bit later, there's two other stories that I will be covering. Harvey Weinstein, I'm sure a lot of you have been hearing about this case. Harvey Weinstein, renowned film producer, studio executive, he's been fired by the Weinstein Company, where he co-chaired with his brother Bob Weinstein. This is in response to the New York Times article chronicling accusations that Mr. Weinstein had sexually assaulted numerous actresses and employees. You've probably heard this constantly in the news, so much coming on from this. But from a legal standpoint, what are his options? What were the options of the Weinstein Company? What does this mean for the industry at large? What does this mean for sexual harassment law? There's a lot to discuss, and you're going to want to hear this because we have some information and some analysis on that. And also, we're going to replay you the riveting interview that our LawNewz's own Rachel Stockman conducted with Lisa Bloom, who was representing Harvey Weinstein, and it was only the next day or the 2 days later that she resigned. A lot to talk about there, but we're going to replay you that interview because it was very interesting. And then also, if we have some time, there's another case that we want to talk to you about. Students in Manatee County, Florida, are trying to do away with a school district code of conduct that requires them to stand for the national anthem. They believe they don't need to do that. They believe they don't have a right they don't believe that the school district has a right to tell them to stand during the national anthem. This presents questions of constitutional law, a very important subject and a very how should I say, it's a subject that we see constantly in the news about players, NFL players taking a knee during the national anthem. So it really is important to talk about today. We'll talk about whether or not they have a case and what the arguments mean for this case as well as the future of the national anthem. So if we have some time, we'll talk about that. But in the meantime, we have to focus on Jessica Chambers, this huge story that captured the nation by attention. It's now we're going to be focusing on it today. A lot to talk about. So here to help me talk a little bit more about it is criminal defense attorney Dan Hochheiser. Dan, thank you so much for joining us here on Law News Network.
Thanks for having me, Jesse.
So a lot to dissect with this case. I'm going to start from the very beginning. We don't know a lot about it, but I am curious, what do you expect the evidence to be for the prosecution to get a conviction from Quentin Tellis? What I know that they have so far, what they seem to say, is there's cell phone evidence of some kind that links him with Chambers at the night of, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that, and then what other evidence they would need to really get a conviction against Mr. Tellis.
Well, Jesse, they talk about 40 witnesses, which sounds overwhelming, but when you strip away the people who come from the telephone companies and the people who come from the other utility companies to try to place him at the scene close to the crime, the question becomes, do they have any eyewitnesses? I think the answer to that is no. What kind of physical evidence do they have? DNA, fingerprint, blood, all this kind of evidence that could connect him in a hard way to this murder. I think the defense is going to be arguing that you don't have enough to connect him beyond a reasonable doubt in this case.
I'll tell you what, we see a lot of cases where in anticipation of the trial, we get a glimpse of what some of the evidence is going to be. They say, trust us, we have some very strong DNA evidence pointing us, we have some really solid witness testimony. I don't really see that happen here. Is it possible they're just keeping it close to the chest and waiting for it to come out in testimony and their evidence in trial?
Prosecutors often do that, which we defense lawyers hate because it is trial by ambush. You really don't know what the prosecution's evidence is until the eve of trial or until the middle of the trial, but we're going to learn a lot from the prosecutor's opening statement. That opening statement is going to be very important, and the defense's opening statement is going to be equally important because hopefully we're going to hear what the defense's theory is of defense. Is it an alibi? Is it something else?
Theory. I want to talk about theory. That's what we have so far. We've seen a lot of people on social media, journalists, talking about what's going on here. Why did this happen? Theorizing. Well, first, before they even had Quentin Tellis in custody, there were many theories about who killed this young girl in such a brutal fashion. And I know the police department was getting fake phone calls, fake tips. Everybody was theorizing what happened because it really is a chilling and horrifying crime against a young 19-year-old girl. Now, like you said in the opening statements, maybe we'll finally get to understand what is the relationship between these two. From what I've seen, they knew each other, but was it more than that? Can you speak a little bit more about maybe what the relationship between the defendant and the victim was?
Well, we don't know a lot about the relationship, but that's going to be huge for the jury because even though the prosecution does not have to prove motive in a criminal case, as you know, the jury wants motive. They want to know the why. They don't want to just know the what. So we're going to have to listen very closely to that prosecution's opening statement to hear the why, because right now we don't know the why.
Right, and it's so chilling because what you imagine is seems like a personal crime, and I want to talk about that. Being burned alive is a very personal crime. Someone took the time to do this, and there's one thing, you get shot, you get stabbed. This is one of the worst ways a person can die. And you have to imagine, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that when you see these kinds of crimes in this fashion, this is not just strangers. This is someone who has a beef against her, someone who has something against this young girl, something they've known each other. Do you see that happening? Because it would be shocking to believe someone could do this to a complete stranger. I mean, let alone it shouldn't be happening to anybody, but the nature of this crime shows that it must be personal. Am I wrong?
Well, we don't know whether you're wrong or not because we don't know exactly what the relationship is. We don't know what the motive is. And as we talked about the defense before, the theory of the defense, is this a situation where the defendant's going to say, I wasn't there, I didn't do it? Or is he going to say something else, like this is an accident?
Right.
We don't know how she was burned. There are only probably two people who do know how she was burned. One of them, unfortunately, is dead, and the other one is not going to be talking unless he testifies at the trial.
There's confusion even whether or not she was burned in her car, got out, which I think the reports are that she was able to get out and maybe walk a few yards away, or was able to walk away from the car, or she was burned outside of the car. We still don't have 100% clarity on that. But again, if in cases, I don't know if you've had a chance, and I hope you didn't, to see anything of this kind of brutality where people are killed, generally speaking, this kind of crime, this kind of act of violence, does it show that sometimes the victim and the defendant knew each other and it was more personal than it was complete strangers?
Well, the horrendous nature or the severity of the crime doesn't really tell you whether it was a stranger on stranger or whether there was a relationship, because these murders have happened in both situations, although we know that more murders are between people who know each other than stranger on stranger. What I'm really interested in this case, and I want to listen to the opening statements about this utterance that the victim made before she died.
Yeah.
She said, she uttered a name. It wasn't Quentin, which is the defendant's name, and I think the defense lawyers are going to make quite a bit about this issue because she said other names which weren't Quentin.
Let's talk about that. My question is, a lot of people have been saying, why did this take so long to find Quinton Tellis? One of the reasons was, as you said, she uttered the name Eric or Derek when firefighters first came to her aid. Now, that means, correct me if I'm wrong, it took investigators so long because they investigated every Eric and Derek in the community. But isn't it also true that due to the nature of her injuries, it injured her trachea, it injured her throat, her vocal cords, and she might not have been saying Eric or Derek, but something else? Can you speak a little bit about that investigation to Erics and Dereks, and what about this idea that her vocal cords might have been damaged?
Well, as a defense lawyer, her vocal cords being damaged, causing her to say two other names besides the defendant's name, I'm not having that as a defense lawyer. And in my summation, my closing argument, I'm going to have in big letters, Eric and Derek, up on an easel or up on a smart screen for the jury to see during my closing argument to say, you want reasonable doubt? Here's reasonable doubt Eric, here's reasonable doubt Derek. Because that's very important, because she knows apparently who burned her. And she says it was Eric or Derek, and the defendant's name is Quinton.
And what about the fact that if the prosecution is, okay, but the investigators investigated every single Eric and Derek in the community. John Champion, who's the prosecutor, said they looked at everybody, nothing. Nothing came back for an Eric and Derek. And again, I hate to say this is a girl who just was burned alive. She just was in the worst possible condition. So is it fair to say what accurately she was saying and not saying? I mean, that's how the prosecution would tailor it, am I correct?
Right, but remember, it's their burden to prove the case.
Right.
So the fact that they couldn't find Eric's or Derek's isn't really the issue, at least from my perspective as a defense attorney, because the burden is on them to prove who did it. Obviously, nobody's going to argue in the courtroom that this wasn't a horrendous crime and this woman was brutally burned. That's not the issue. This is a whodunit.
Yeah. Yeah. And let's talk a little bit about that jury, because we saw jury selection yesterday. I'm going to play two sides with you right now. You're the defense counsel, criminal defense attorney. Who do you want on that jury?
Wow. Well, I don't want young women if I can help it. We have a 19-year-old female victim. But I do want people who are sympathetic. I like social workers. I like people who are in the arts. Don't want a lot of law enforcement folks on the jury if I can help it. And the prosecution will probably want just the opposite. They want the more conservative law and order type jurors. Here I understand there's a pretty nice mix racially and in terms of gender, so that'll be interesting.
Do you think that's a factor? I mean, we're talking about Mississippi, we're talking about an African-American defendant, we're talking about a white victim. How does that play into the dynamics of this case?
I wish I could say it wasn't so, but race is always a huge issue in a case, particularly when you have an African-American defendant. We've seen that throughout the years, starting back with the O.J. Simpson trial, and it continues today. Race is a huge factor because people's life experience, the way they've been treated by the police over the years, it just has a big effect on how people view law enforcement testimony.
Interesting. And again, we don't know the relationship between the defendant and the victim. There are reports that they were in a romantic relationship. I wonder how that might play out further for the defense and the prosecution, because there really is something to be said when, and we've covered tons of cases here on the LawNewz Network, and a lot of times it's lovers, it's people that are in some sort of relationship. Why is it that we see so many crimes? And again, I'm not presuming anything. I don't know what the relationship is. If in fact they were in a romantic relationship, why do you see so many crimes today between spouses, between boyfriends, girlfriends? Can you speak a little bit about that? Why do we see that happening? You would think two people in a loving relationship or some sort of relationship like that, why would we see that?
Well, murder is generally about one of three things: sex, drugs, or money. So here, a romantic relationship. The reason that you see so many violent crimes arising out of romantic relationships is because of the passion. Okay, emotions run high. Oftentimes you have a third party, a lover of one of the couple that interferes in the relationship and makes somebody jealous. We just don't know. So I don't know what kind of investigation the prosecution did about whether somebody was cheating in this relationship, if there was in fact a relationship, or what the story was, but I have a feeling we're going to find out real soon.
Let's talk about no death penalty. So this is a capital murder offense. It's murder while in the commission of committing third-degree arson. He would be eligible for the death penalty, but the prosecutor's office, the state attorney, is not choosing for the death penalty. Why is that? Or why do you think?
Maybe they didn't think that they had the facts to support a death penalty sentencing phase argument, in that even though it's heinous, there are levels of heinousness. You have one victim, you don't have multiple victims. She was not killed immediately. So there may be a question of whether the killing was intentional. So I don't know all the reasons why the prosecution chose to take the death penalty off the table. But these death penalty decisions are very fact specific. So I just don't have all the facts to know why they made that decision. But life in prison without parole is a pretty stiff hammer anyway.
Is it possible that prosecutors see that as a worse punishment than just giving someone the death penalty? I mean, if you're spending the rest of your life in prison, and that might include solitary confinement, that is not a pleasant life. This guy's 29 years old. He would live the rest of his life in prison. Do prosecutors say that, in my eyes, that's a worse punishment for you than you being sent to be killed?
I don't know if prosecutors take that position. I've heard that argument. I think that there are obviously some moral objections some people have, that human beings shouldn't be playing God and taking life. Some people believe that. Other people think, well, in such a heinous crime, the only justice is the death penalty. The bottom line is the death penalty is extremely, extremely expensive. Once you have a death penalty finding of guilt, now you're talking about years and years and years of litigation. Maybe the prosecution didn't want to go through that kind of litigation. I don't know what their reasons were, but obviously they had them.
I've seen that too, especially because, for our viewers, there's the guilt and innocence phase, and then it's a bifurcated trial. There's a second phase to determine whether or not he would be sentenced to death. That's increased costs for the community, the taxpayers. And as you said, I think they must have done a huge investigation into what happened. They did do a huge investigation into what happened to this young girl. Now they're expending their resources in a trial, which they have to do, but maybe, like you said, there's only so much that they're willing to place in their budget for this guy, Quentin Tellitz. I mean, at the end of the day, they want justice, but they also have to protect the budget. Am I correct? That's an actual practical issue.
I don't know how much prosecutors take into account budgetary concerns. In my experience, that's really not their focus. Their focus is supposed to be to do justice, whatever the costs are, and there are people who are politicians who worry about the budgets. However, in this situation, they may have evidence that is mitigating in terms of Tellitz's background. I don't know enough about his background. I know he did have a record, but there may be things about his background that caused the prosecutor to move away from the death penalty.
Let's talk about his background. He has been in and out of jail. He's had instances with the law. In fact, he was convicted for unauthorized use of a debit card in connection with the death of a 34-year-old Taiwanese exchange student. She wound up dead, stabbed over 30 times. Initially, he wasn't charged with the crime, but then later on was indicted in connection with that crime, I believe, last year. They haven't had a trial yet for that. So this is a guy, let's break it down. This is a guy who's been in and out of jail. This is a guy who has now been indicted in another murder, and he's pled guilty to unauthorized use of a debit card, and now he's facing, I think, 10 years in prison for that. Okay, so we know this guy has a rap sheet. I would imagine that was probably what led investigators to look at him a little bit further. But how do all of those prior bad acts, and let's talk about it from a legal standpoint, how would that be affected in this trial, and what can and cannot be used in this trial?
Well, first of all, the defense will have to get a ruling before the trial begins. They probably already have it about what the prosecution can cross-examine, tell us about, should Tellus take the stand and testify in his own defense. That's always a huge concern as a defense lawyer, where I have a murder case where there's only usually two people who really know what happened. One of them is your client. If your client can testify, that's huge. When he has a terrible record like he does, where he has this theft of this Taiwanese student's debit card and he made false charges all over the place with it, that makes his credibility down to pretty close to zero because he's a thief. So, you know, that takes whether he can testify really pretty much off the table, because the jury is probably not going to believe anything the guy says given his background. So that really hurts strategically from a defense standpoint. But how much the judge is going to let in about that other murder, which is a stabbing, it's not a burning, it's a different case, that may be too inflammatory for the judge to let that evidence in, because the judge may take the position that if I let that conviction in and all that evidence in, the jury may convict him not for the murder of Chambers, but for the murder of the Taiwanese student, and the judge doesn't want that because that's not fair.
Right. Again, the idea is that you don't want to show that he just acted in conformity or something of that nature. We see that many times. So just because you did something bad in the past doesn't mean you're guilty of this crime. Now, it could be used for another purpose, right? So you can imagine that sometimes we see something where you could use it for he had a motive to commit this crime, or he had access to be able to commit this crime. So it's going to be a kind of an interesting move, because I know the prosecution really wants to put this in. They want to show this, but they would have to do it for a very strategic reason in connection with this case, and they seem unrelated, so I don't know how it would work.
Well, there are a couple of things. I mean, first, we'll see what the defense theory is. If the defense theory were to be that this was a mistake, it was an accident, it wasn't an intentional act, then perhaps they could put in the Taiwanese exchange student murder to show a pattern of violence and to identify this person as somebody who kills people. That might be an exception. The other thing is they may argue to the judge, the prosecutor would, that they need to put in the information about the Taiwanese student's stabbing and the use of the debit card to complete the narrative of how they focused on Tellus. My understanding is that's how they got to him.
Yeah. That
stabbing investigation led investigators to focus on Tellus in the Chambers burning case.
That might be the key right there. That might be, because remember, he, as I said, he was initially interviewed. It's fine. They didn't question him further. Then he gets convicted for the, or at least he gets implicated in this. He pleads guilty to the use of the card, and now all of a sudden he gets indicted in this case. So again, I think that might be, if they can lead a roadmap, because people want answers. This investigation took over a year. They interviewed the entire community. They believe they arrested drug dealers. Nobody knew anything about what happened to Jessica Chambers, and now they had a guy in custody. And again, everybody who hears this case wants justice for Jessica. And you're hoping that the investigators, the police, got the right guy here, and now it's on trial. But then again, we have a situation where it's up for a jury to determine his guilt or innocence, and it's possible that he had nothing to do with this crime, which leads me into my next question. You're a criminal defense attorney. I'd like for you to lay out some of the ways, you talked about it a little bit, some of the ways you'd start poking holes in this case. You talked about Eric and Derek. Let's talk a little bit about cell phone evidence. We know that the firefighters are going to be taking the stand either today or tomorrow. You're a defense attorney. How would you poke holes in their testimony? How would you poke holes in cell phone evidence? How would you poke holes in just in general in this case? Again, we don't have a lot of information. We don't know a lot. I know I'm asking a kind of overloaded question, but I am curious, because we have you here, what you would think to do.
Well, you know, in terms of the cell phone evidence, you know, it depends what that evidence is going to be. Are they going to show records that show calls bouncing off cell towers near the scene of the crime? If they do that, as a defense attorney, I say to the jury, well, that's very nice, but that's not proof beyond a reasonable doubt that the person burned a woman. That's proof that he was in the area, like a lot of other people were in the area. Now, in terms of the firefighters, I don't think the firefighters are going to be able to connect the defendant to the burning, because they come after the fact. So, it's going to be a very difficult road for the prosecution to tie this case up in a bow without an eyewitness or without some of the defendant's DNA at the scene, his blood at the scene, his saliva at the scene, his fingerprints at the scene. If they don't have hard evidence and they don't have an eyewitness, and maybe they do, it's going to be tough.
What you were just watching, I don't know if we could replay that graphic, or you might see it in a minute on the loop, is the last known image of Jessica Chambers before the attack. She went to a gas station a short time before the attack took place. You see her walking in, you see people around her. This is chilling because little does she know, in about a half hour or so, and a little bit longer than that, her life is going to be over. She's going to be killed in a brutal, brutal fashion. I want to talk about this gas station video and how it's going to play. We know that one of the gas station attendants said that she was filling up a lot of gas, and he asked her about it, and I believe she said that she was going somewhere. We don't know what that means. We don't know what that connection is. But looking at that video, how would that video play in for the case? How will that be presented?
Well, first of all, those three men who appear in the video, I mean, that's, as an investigator, that's the first place you're going to start. I'm sure those people have been interviewed up and down, inside and out, assuming that the police found those people. So they may have information. Did they have conversations with her? What did she say about where she was going? I mean, filling up a tank of gas is not unusual. People generally fill up their tank when they go to a gas station. So the question is, what are the words that Jessica Chambers said to any of those people who were in that gas station at that time, and does that shed any light about what happened a half hour later?
Well, it does establish, which you don't see in a lot of cases, where she was at a specific time. So now you're able to map out her place, or you're able to map out her night, or at least where she was the night before. So I'm sure for investigators, for attorneys, that helps, when you're interviewing people and their stories don't quite match up. So if somebody said, oh, I was with Jessica at this time, but she was really at the gas station, then you know they're lying. So I wonder if there's a possibility, because I don't know how many people were able to see that video. I don't know if people that will be on the witness stand are able to see it, but I wonder if it could be used to discredit witnesses in a way. What do you think about that?
Well, it depends what the witnesses say, but what I am interested in is, while she's at this gas station on this surveillance, where is Tellis?
Yeah.
What's the narrative on that track? What is he doing at that time? There's sort of two parallel lives being led here. There's Chambers, who's at this gas station, so the jury wants to know, where's Tellis at this time? And then as things go, as she leaves the gas station, where's Tellis at that time? And as you get closer to the actual incident, how close can they put Tellis to the place where she walks out of the car and is burned and tries to get help? So these are all $64,000 questions, which we're waiting to hear.
I know we all are waiting to hear. This case is horrific. What is it about this case, though? Is it the nature of the crime? Is it how she was 19 years old? What is it about this case that really has captured the nation's attention, that everybody's talking about it, everybody's going to be watching it, everybody's going to be turning into LawNewz to watch the live stream of it? What about this case has just shocked viewers, and everybody wants answers to it? What do you think in your mind is that reason?
Well, you have an innocent loss of life. You have an attractive young woman. You have a defendant who has a record, who appears to be involved in at least one other murder, allegedly. So you have the grisly nature of the burning. So unfortunately, or fortunately, for LawNewz, America's appetite for these types of sensational fact patterns has been there for a long time and will continue, because it's an interesting case, and the question is going to be, can the prosecution prove the case? We don't know.
And I think also and as you said, people need answers, and I think one of the reasons people follow these cases so closely, and what we saw, the reason people have such a fascination in true crime and why people are fascinated in LawNewz, is it's such a grisly crime. It's such a terrible crime. We see these crimes. We want to know who did it. We want answers. We need those answers. We need answers to make sense of what happened. Because to live in a world where you don't, something like this happens and you can't put a finger on who did it or why, it leaves a chill in the air. It leaves people don't know how to live their lives in that way. And I think it's very important that people follow this trial to learn a little bit more about this case, to have some more information. And if in fact Quentin Tellis is found guilty, then it can, hopefully provide some sort of justice for the family. And again, it's a horrific crime. We are talking so much about the case right now before we have any information. Again, I'm here with criminal defense attorney Dan Hochheiser, and once the case starts, we're going to have a lot more to talk about. Again, the case will be starting at around 2 p.m. today, and hopefully, Dan, we have you back on to talk about this case as well as some other cases that we have. And again, we thank you so much for talking a little bit about this case. We might have you on in a little bit to talk about another case, but again, thank you so much for your thoughts on the Jessica Chambers case. We appreciate it.
Pleasure.
Thank you. So